Okay, we are all geared up to talk about Heislers and Climaxes and Shay locomotives here on Trains Live. No, listen, Mr. Bob hasn't slipped a tooth on his gear. This is a conversation about geared locomotives. You know what? They're small and they're definitely unusual. And when you see one, man, you just got to look at it. We're talking about geared locomotives, Shays, Heisler, Climax locomotives. They were an integral part of the logging industry, the mining industry here in the U.S. And they really have got a neat little story all of their own. And speaking of stories, this is where I'm going to bring in our guest for today, Kevin Gilliam from our video services department is with us. Kevin, hello. How you doing today?
Good, Bob. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. We've had Kevin on Trains Live here before. Quick refresher, Kevin, we stationed him all the way out in North Carolina. A lot of neat activity going on the East Coast, and Kevin is covering that and capturing video and also working on a number of projects. And his latest project that he is beginning to work on is a new video in the Great American Steam Locomotive series. Yep, this one is on geared locomotives. And Kevin, you're kind of right at the beginning of the project, yes?
We're right at the beginning. Basically, we thought about it. We were doing articulateds. If you technically push this out to the level, geared locomotives are kind of articulateds, which was the last engine in the series, but we said, you know, that's really stretching the boundaries of what an articulated covers. So let's just do this. Let's just do this on their own. You know, the geared engines, they're cool, they're neat. There's really nothing else like them. So let's just make it their own video. So that's kind of where we're at.
There we go. Another one in the series, and it'll be an in-depth look at this particular type of locomotive. And I'll tell you what, I think before we get too far into it, let's take a step back, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers know what geared locomotives are. In fact, you know, it's kind of one of those niches in the rail enthusiast world that, you know, people like big boy and articulated locomotives and people like interurbans. Well, there are those that also are very enthused about geared locomotives. So exactly what are they? And I've got on the workbench here today a couple of models. And if you look here, we have a HO scale model of a regular steam locomotive. And you can see up in the front, we have the valves and cylinders, the rods connecting to the driving wheels. That's how we get power on a regular steam locomotive, that reciprocating action that we all know and basically is kind of the common steam locomotive. Okay, let's jump over to the geared locomotives that we are talking about here. And one of those that I mentioned was a Climax. And if you notice on our model of the Climax here, here's our cylinders. There is some reciprocating action, but when we look at the bottom of the locomotive, we go into a gearbox, and then there is a drive shaft that goes from that gearbox out to the trucks on each end that swivel very nicely, and that is how the power is delivered on these geared locomotives. It's not that reciprocating action through the rods to the wheels. No, this has got basically a drive shaft assembly like you might see on a road vehicle. And Kevin, I'm sure you can enlighten us further, but this really gives a very sure-footed locomotive, one that's able to go up some pretty steep grades, handle some pretty steep curves, which kind of was the characteristic of a lot of these logging railroads.
Yeah, I mean, you basically think of a geared engine as kind of like the Offroad version, the SUV. Now, we're not talking about these. We're not talking about these new SUVs that'll simply jump over a curb to get to the parking space at the mall faster. These are the ones that are really designed to go off into the woods, bad tracks, steep grades, sharp curves, basically everything you don't want on a regular railroad.
Now,
So
you know,
you had to make new stuff.
You know, when you talk about, though, the off-road of locomotives, and I love that analogy, you know, some of these logging railroads, steep grades, 11%, man, that is a steep grade. Curves, incredibly sharp curves. The other one that I really liked in learning about these is that, you know, there were some of the railroads that would take a full-size tree once it's harvested, cut it longitudinally, and use the two halves as a bridge for the railroad. But there was some that if the stream that they had to cross was shallow enough, they just laid the tracks right down in the water across the stream bed, and you took your locomotive and forded the stream. I mean, let's go off-roading, man.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, you get into some of the stuff, they're using wooden rails. I mean, this is, you know, what's the cheapest way I can get rails in here to get the trees out? That's basically what it is. And, you know, any cost savings that you can think of, I mean, it's not going to be in here that long. Once you cut the trees down, it's going to take a while for them to grow back, so you're going to have to take your railroad somewhere else. So put it in, get the stuff, harvest everything, get it out, go somewhere else, do it again.
Sure. Now,
I don't want to spend a whole lot of money doing
it. Yeah, that cuts down on that profit margin on the end there. So, logging railroads, in your research for the upcoming video, where have you found them? I mean, is this kind of a pocket in certain parts of the country, or where are we talking logging railroads?
It's pockets, but it's more than that. I mean, you find them a lot in the mountains, but basically what you have to do is you have to find trees. If you can find trees, you could probably find a logging railroad. You get out in the, you know, the Midwest and the West, or you know, parts of the Southwest where it's flat and, you know, no trees, you're not going to find many logging railroads there. So, but, you know, even, you know, South Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, Eastern Virginia, flat places, not where you'd expect to see logging railroads, but there were trees. They had to cut down the trees to make the towns. So you had logging railroads pushing in. Most of the stuff, now the big stuff, what you really want are big trees. You're not going to find big trees, especially on the East Coast. You're going to need good diameter trees to get viable logs out of them. What does that mean? It means you got to go inland, you've got to go into the mountains. That's where your big trees are. So your pockets, your big pockets of logging there were some, you know, foothills, sand hills, you know, that type of thing. But a lot of your big stuff was in the mountains. That's where a lot of the logging was. So that's basically East Coast and West Coast. And they both had a couple of different challenges.
Sure. You know, and I will do a little foreshadowing here when we get to Mr. Bob's Railroad bookcase at the end. There's a book about logging railroads in South Carolina I want to show everybody. But you mentioned South Carolina and being one of those places. At one point, South Carolina had 258 little logging railroads. Yeah, 258 just in South Carolina. I mean, that, you know, that it's an incredible number for a state that size. I think it also goes to show that, you know, Kevin, like you were saying, these logging railroads, it's harvest the timber, you know, it's get out. The railroad might be there for a few months, a few years. That's it. Nothing, you know, nothing of permanence. You know, the other thing you mentioned about having to go where the timber is, and something that I thought was kind of interesting in reading a bit about these geared locomotives, and especially the logging part, it seemed that logging in the U.S. took a progression just as the country developed, you know, from East Coast to West Coast, and that, you know, in the 1800s, you know, the amount of lumber that was coming out of the territory around Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon was a fraction of what it was by, say, when you got to the 1970s. In fact, by the 1970s, and you talk about, you know, go west, young logger, by the 1970s, 41% of the timber harvested here in the U.S. came from the Pacific Northwest. And I'm sure, as you're going to discover in producing the video, yeah, there was a lot of logging railroads out there. The big timber.
Yeah, that's where you got the big trees. I mean, think of redwoods. Think of some of these huge trees that you find in California. That's where the big trees were. All the stuff on the East Coast by that point, anything big had been cut down, or the other option is you got something like the Great Smoky Mountains National Park where they decided to preserve what was left. So
Sure.
you want big trees, you got to go west. That's
There
the
we
only thing that
go.
was left.
Go west, young lumberjack. I'm sure that, and I want to kind of pose this question to you in producing the video, but folks who like trains, there, as we talked a few minutes ago, there seems to be everyone has their niche, everyone has their favorite. Why should someone take a step aside and take a look at geared locomotives? What's the appeal? What makes them so special?
I think I remember a passage in a book that was called West Virginia Logging Railroads by William E. Wharton. And he said, presume that you found yourself, in the early 1900s, and you wake up and all of a sudden you're in West Virginia. You see this huge plume of smoke in the distance, so you think, okay, there's got to be something really heavy train, moving, heading this way. But all of a sudden you hear this rapid fire exhaust sounding like a fast passenger train, and then you get this little thing coming at you at 5-6 miles an hour, swaying back and forth, looking like it's about to rattle itself to death, hauling a load of logs at you. It's the strangest thing you've ever seen. I mean, people look at steam engines, and I think one of the big appeals is everything's visible. You can see what it's doing. It's not hidden behind a shroud like a diesel is. And for the logging engines, even more so. You can see this stuff. You can see the gears turning. You can see everything moving with it. That's
Sure.
where a lot of this is cool. And if you take the number of steam locomotives that were built in the U.S., probably over 150,000, probably somewhere approaching 200,000. I don't exactly know the number. Now take the number of geared engines that were made. Maybe 4,000 plus or minus, but now look and see how many survive. They're disproportionately preserved compared to the other ones. There's a lot of them that survived very late in the game, and there's some good reasons for it. But there's a lot of these things that are still left. So if you go out and see steam engines, whether they're rod engines, whether they're the geared engines, there's a lot of these logging engines that survived very, very late in the game, and they got to the point that they were able to be preserved. So your chances of actually being able to find one on display or operating, they're higher than just a normal steam engine.
Is it, do you think it is just because of the fact that they were, first off, there was such a small number of them built to begin with, but then when you think about it, they really kind of were hidden from the normal vantage point for seeing a steam locomotive. We want to see, you want to see the latest Baltimore and Ohio fast passenger locomotive, or something from the Illinois Central or the Union Pacific. In its day, you could just easily walk down to the station in town. These geared locomotives, unless there was a situation where there was a sawmill in town, in the city where you lived, you had to go out into the forest, into the backwoods, to see one of these things in operation. Weigh in on that. How does that figure in their popularity, or in their familiarity with people, or just our general knowledge about them?
I think at the time, I think they were more hidden, but at the same time, you got to think about this with the steam engines. When you get into the 1950s, out of what was left of the logging stuff, there were certain pockets that were still going real strong into the 1960s. So you go full scale, look at the country in general, you have diesels coming in at a rapid pace after World War II, steam's going away real quick. People, you want to go see real steam working, where are you going to have to go? You're going to have to go further off the beaten path. And some of these geared engines, And the logging fields, that's one place you could go, or take a random thing like the Graham County Railroad in North Carolina. They used geared engines just hauling, regular, mixed freight, oil,
Okay.
boxcars, everything else coming in.
Sure.
So you get people making pilgrimage. They go further and further out of field trying to find what's left. And some of these engines were surviving. Graham County was operating steam. They missed being the last common carrier steam railroad in the U.S. by 2 weeks. 2 weeks, that's it.
Jeez.
So,
all right.
if it had ended a little different, a Shay would have been the last common carrier steam locomotive operating in the U.S.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Now, I think the other part with this too, and something that I've found interesting, and I want to see if you're seeing this in your research and filming, but okay, logging industry. Again, it's kind of one of those businesses that it takes place out in the woods. It's not something that we're seeing on a regular basis, but yet we're looking at one little block in the whole logging industry, and yet the whole business really is another thing that affects us every single day. I mean, when you think about all the products that are made out of timber, our furniture, our homes, our paper that we use, on and on and on and on. How does someone put their mind around these geared locomotives in relation to the bigger picture of the entire logging or mining industry that they served? It kind of seems like you got to have a little bit of understanding of that whole picture to have these things make sense.
Hey, let me give you two sides, and I think this will kind of expand it. At least in the East, there was also a lot of tanning. So you want to do production of leather. That's coming from the logging industry.
Okay.
And the other thing, and I think this kind of brings everything full circle. So let's take us back to early 1900s. The Wright brothers are trying to build an airplane. They need wood to build the airplane. Where do they go? They went to Cass, West Virginia, of all places, to get the wood to build the first airplane.
Okay, and Cass, of course, being now a West Virginia state park, which has preserved the logging railroad, which uses geared locomotives to make the trip up Bald Knob, bring the timber back. So in other words, Kevin, are you telling me that we don't have an airplane if it's not for the railroads?
That's about what I'm telling you. That they would have had to build it out of something else. Or wait a little bit.
That high-tech aluminum wasn't quite there in the early 1900s.
Yeah, it wasn't there, and I don't know if you're going to make steel fly too well. Yeah. I guess you could have gone to the Pittsburgh steel industry for something, but I mean, think about, you have entire towns. You're building houses, you're building industry. All this stuff is using wood to build as the country's expanding west. So, you're looking at literally the engines that transported the building blocks of America.
Yeah, when you talk about the railroads building America, we think about the transcontinental railroads, and we think about moving passengers. And in this instance, as you're explaining it, this is the railroads helping an industry, and without them being woven together, they don't work. And without them working, there's so many things that we don't particularly have.
Let me give you one more that I'm thinking about while I'm here. This ties everything in also. So you've got this. These logging people, they were pretty smart. They learned, don't get rid of extra stuff. So you saw the logs, you get wood chips. What can you use wood chips for? Paper.
Sure.
So there you go. There's the paper industry with all this stuff of how we preserve history, write down our history, teach people new stuff.
Exactly.
That comes directly from the logging industry.
Sure. And it took the trains to get the railroad, to get the logs to the mills to produce, and so on and so forth. So, have you started filming for this video yet?
Yeah, the filming's basically already done.
Oh, okay. Wow.
There's probably one or two interviews that we've got to get actually on Cass specifically,
Sure.
Cass Scenic Railroad, that type of thing. I want to get a little bit more interview stuff done there, but pretty much all the footage for the steam engines, that's all filmed. I was out in Western North Carolina yesterday at a place called the Cradle of Forestry. There's a good friend of mine named Jerry Ledford, who's a very knowledgeable person on the Eastern, especially the North Carolina area logging stuff. We needed someone who could talk about the East Coast and some of the particular challenges that were faced here. So went out and filmed that, got some good stuff out of that. So now it's headlong into making scenes develop. And I think there's another interview that might have been filmed recently with you.
Yeah, there might be a guy that looks something like me that might make it in just a little bit if I don't hit the cutting room floor. So that actually that actually leads me to my next question. All right, so as a videographer, what was the coolest thing? What's the neatest thing that you saw in filming this that we should be looking for when we see the final version?
Well, so this is probably the coolest thing. It's probably going to be the end thing. I think everyone that's even vaguely familiar with logging geared engines knows that West Virginia, the Cass Scenic Railroad, is now kind of it's been the mecca for geared engines for a very, very long time. So let's go back to the year 2020. Everyone's shut down with COVID. No one knows what to do with all these places. So Cass, if you've ever been there, there's this huge long parking lot where all this lumber drying sheds and all this stuff used to be. They've now turned it into a huge parking lot so it can accommodate a whole lot of people with the tracks along the edge. Well, the Cass said, hey, we can't really run trains too much. This doesn't work too well. But what we can do is fire them up. So middle of the summer, but when basically the whole railroad tourist industry is shut down, Cass said, hey, we're going to put everything together, do some side-by-side stuff, and then couple them up and run them by everybody. And we're just going to do this as a free thing just to get people out and maybe let them live just a little bit. So they coupled 5 engines together and ran them back and forth on the track, maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet of track between the depot and the shop where people could be outside and they could just watch this stuff go by. And I'll be honest, we like 1 engine. We like 2. 3 gets pretty rare. But 5 engines together, all blowing whistles, making noise. And these are, they had a climax running. They had 4 shays. It was just absolutely amazing listening to all this with the whistles and everything going back and forth.
I think you for me, you hit it on the head. The sound would have been just spectacular. Reciprocating locomotives make one kind of a noise. These geared locomotives, as we talk, something completely different. And to hear that, the intricate little sounds, and if you could discern between the locomotives, I think that would have been even more interesting. So, okay, I want to go out hunting geared locomotives. Where are you going to send me? Where should I go take a look?
Well, what part of the country do you want to start with?
Give me your top 3 spots that I should hit.
I think the top period is probably going to be the Cass Scenic Railroad in West Virginia. There's Cass and Durban, and they've now kind of combined the 2 operations. So there's now a river line and a mountain, but I think they're saying they may actually have 6 engines under steam for a parade of steam. They've got shays, they've got a climax, they've got a Heisler, which is undergoing a little bit of rebuild. I'm not sure if it's actually going to run this year or not. It was in need of a little bit of work, but they're going to have 6 engines running there. That's a cool spot to go. Let's see, where can we do? If you want a spot on the West Coast, I'd say Roaring Camp and Big Trees. They're one of the oldest. They're in the California Redwoods. Perfect spot. They've been going forever. This is their big 60th anniversary this year, so that's a good spot. third one, gosh, I'm going to have to think about this. Normally in the past, I would say it was Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad up in
Sure.
Washington because they have a lot of stuff, but they kind of shut down during COVID. That was kind of the West Coast hotspot. Um, Most of the other places you're going to kind of get like one or two, one engine running here and there, but at least those are
Sure.
definitely the top two. I think the third one I'd have to keep thinking about for a
All
while.
right, we'll have to check back with you on that one. Tell you what, before we head out today, we got to head over to the bookcase, Mr. Bob's Railroad bookcase. Let me tell you what, this isn't just a bookcase. I could have brought the whole library along with me today. There are literally hundreds of books out there on logging railroads. Let me just give you a few examples, folks. We had mentioned earlier South Carolina. How about a book specifically on the logging railroads of South Carolina? This one by Tom Fetters. As you go through this book, there is detail on all the different little railroads, good maps indicating where they were, some nice pictures of the different equipment and the operations. Older book, folks. So this one is it's a library, or head to your local museum, or if there is a historical society in your area that had logging involvement, that's where you're going to want to look for those. But South Carolina logging railroads of South Carolina. We were just talking about the big trees and logging the redwoods, and yes, they were logged, and the pictures in this one out in California, again, some very neat pictures of the railroads and interaction with the waterways out there and the different railroads. And we mentioned some of those structures. How about the spindly trestle bridge there? Again, great pictures, great information, specifically on logging the redwoods. Again, an older book. Head for your library looking for this one. One other one that is on the older shelf. Here we go. Kind of that general book of logging railroads in the West, and you can just tell by the graphics. Older book, but again, good information. Tons. Oh, I'm not going across that trestle, folks. Sorry. Again, tons of good photographs, a lot of information about the locomotives and the operations, the logging camp on wheels, on rails. So this also gives you some good background as far as what it was like in the logging industry itself. Now, these sorts of books, these are just examples, and literally there are hundreds and hundreds of books like this. Perfect example here in our library, our Kalmbach library. There is over 115 books just on logging railroads and the geared locomotives. Now, there's 3 books I want to share with you that really are kind of the in-depth look at these particular locomotives. We have talked about Heisler locomotives, and Benjamin Klein has a book completely detailing the Heisler locomotive, and this is kind of one of my little fun personal things. You look at the Heisler, and the pistons, the cylinders, are in a V shape under the boiler. Well, you usually don't consider steam locomotives this way, but if you get a V8 in your pickup truck, we got a V2 here on our steam locomotives. But again, a good look at just the Heisler locomotive, detailing how the gearing works, history of the different companies that made the locomotives, a complete in-depth look at just this particular one. The Heisler locomotive by Benjamin Klein. Again, you're going to have to hit the library for this one. Bit of an older book. Probably the popular one, the reference, if you will, the Shea locomotive, Titans of the Timber by Michael Cook. Cook, again, deep dive into just the Shay locomotive. The one thing that is neat about Cook's book here is there are some very interesting color plates that talk about or that illustrate the Shay locomotives. And just, you know, kind of as an added bonus, an older book, kind of that older craftsmanship, if you will. The onion skin, the flypaper protecting those colors, they actually have it embossed in a spider web pattern that has the caption on it. That's kind of an interesting, strange little feature in an older book like this. Again, as I mentioned, older book, going to have to hit the library or a museum for it, but if you're looking for Shay locomotive information, this is the one. This is the reference. And of course, there was a third type of geared locomotive, and that was the Climax, and have just a beautiful book by Dennis Thompson, Richard Dunn, and Steve Hoff on the Climax locomotive. And again, photos of the locomotives talking about their development, where they were used, how they were used, the big timber involved in all of this. So the Climax locomotive by Thompson, Dunn, and Hoff. Those three are probably your big looks if you want the technical information on the geared locomotives. So Kevin Gilliam, our videographer for the next edition in the Great American Locomotive Series, Great American Steam Locomotive Series. Got to get that in there. Kevin, okay, I hate to put you on the spot, but when are we going to be able to watch this? When are we going to be able to watch this good video here?
Well, my due date's early May, so it's actually going to be sooner than you think.
So sometime this summer. There you go. So listen, folks, here's your first summer movie you got to put on that list. Great American Steam Locomotive Series geared locomotives. It will be available through KalmbachHobbyStore.com. KalmbachHobbyStore.com. Want to see you there shopping the aisles for videos, books, modeling products. KalmbachHobbyStore.com. Kevin, big thanks for being with us today. Good to chat with you as always. And I'm sure we will have more discussions as more of these neat projects flow off of your editing bay. So thank you so much.
Yep, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Hey, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Trains Live. I want to see you on trains.com very soon. Plenty of new content, new things going on there just about every single day. And, of course, I really want to see you behind an issue of Trains Magazine as soon as we can.